Bonjour tout le monde, merci de l'introduction. Je vais traiter mes commentaires cet après-midi en anglais, mais vous allez voir la traduction sur l'écran. Et félicitations au Centre d'équité pour avoir organisé cet événement cet après-midi. Thank you everyone. In my 5 to 7 minutes presentation this afternoon, I would like to address something along the lines of legal perspectives regarding systemic discrimination in nursing practica for nursing students. Go to the next slide. So there's basically 6 points that I want to address this afternoon, and just briefly, and then I'll go into each slide. Highlighting the importance of research in this area, and Dr. Dasgupta started that off, and I think that we need to get the ball rolling to fill the lacuna between the research on nursing practice and practica for students. And I think there's a bit of a gap there, and I'll go into that. The next two points deal with cases that I've litigated before the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, dealing with strategic problems, point 2, in terms of raising systemic discrimination concerns. 3, the anecdotal type of information that we see in those kinds of complaints, and how that dovetails with some of the comments you heard just recently from Dr. Dasgupta. The last sort of 3 points, I think, stem from an interesting perspective that I was privy to as I sat on a panel last semester organized by the Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing. So I got a perspective from the administration, and I'd like to integrate some of my thoughts on that in terms of how schools of nursing respond to the same issues sort of from the other side of the table. And I think that's instructive in this debate. So next slide. So in terms of the question of research, systemic discrimination, at least in terms of how we present it in a case or complaint before the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, is something that basically is used to support an individual complaint of discrimination. Unlike the federal context, there's not a specific statutory provision where you make systemic complaints, but basically, as the argument goes, if there's a culture or a system of discrimination, that buttresses or adds to the individualized nature of the complaint. I've represented different nursing students in complaints before the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and certainly I felt that palpable gap in terms of the evidence, as Dr. Dasgupta spoke about what she has researched, and I would say some pivotal research in the area of labor and employment as far as systemic discrimination goes for nursing. We don't have that for the practicum context, and by that I mean to say, which a lot of you are familiar with, there are different competing interests. It's not the labor market interest that necessarily predominates, because you have issues of, on the one hand, the control of the academic and pedagogical environment. On the flip side, you have issues of patient concern, patient safety, and delivery of service. So you have, it's sort of a hybridized environment, which is different than a straight sort of labor analysis or a workplace analysis. So with these competing considerations, I think we need to flesh out the research in this area. Next slide. So 2 strategic points that I bring up in the context of human rights cases that I've represented before the HRTO, that's the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. First, again, as I've indicated, because under the provincial code, systemic discrimination is not a specific avenue that's statutorily advanced. There isn't a lot of helpful jurisprudence in terms of how we build our case on systemic discrimination, and in fact, on these kinds of issues, there's very, very little jurisprudence, such that the tribunal itself is not that receptive to these kinds of complaints, where you're basically using either individualized or collective experiences to buttress or support your complaint in a specific circumstance. So there's a general reticence, I would submit, in my experience, of the tribunal to take jurisdiction of such complaints. And I can go into detail if you guys have questions on that. The next point is an interesting one, and I think it again dovetails with a point that Dr. Dasgupta brought up, is that of intersectional discrimination. And when Dr. Dasgupta talked about speaking white, one of the concerns here raised, and this was one of the issues raised in one of the complaints, or a couple of complaints that I addressed before the Human Rights Tribunal, is criticism of linguistic delivery, where persons essentially, because they come from other countries, have a different accent in speaking French. This is particularly the case in the bilingual program, well, the once truly bilingual program, not anymore, truly bilingual program of nursing at University of Ottawa. I can go into a bit more detail on that if you have questions, but basically, so say that this notion of speaking white is a disguised way of criticizing or critiquing communication skills, when behind it, and there's certain information, anecdotal and some documented, on the part of University of Ottawa staff, saying that with the multicultural, sort of multi-racialized background of the School of Nursing, there are these linguistic problems that are coming up, and it's particularly an issue in the context of nursing practicums, because what do you do when you go into a primarily French-speaking environment where the student is essentially, for all intents and purposes, unilingual French-speaking? So it raises an interesting question, because the academic environment should support that ability to speak in the both official languages, but the practical environment does not. So there's a kind of contradiction there, and I think that it's a ripe issue to deal with, but it's one that the tribunals are not so ready to deal with in terms of the law. Next slide. In terms of some of the anecdotal evidence, and this is not evidence that ultimately was addressed on its merits, because the complaints that I dealt with were resolved in one fashion or another before we got to a final hearing, is that the stereotypes that are made in many respects against black nursing students, where some, I think striking examples, where it was said that black nursing students by certain preceptors go into the profession to make money, whereas white students go into the profession for the higher values. So this kind of statement that's made, obviously it has a palpable effect when it's made. Whatever racial bias or stereotype it's based upon, I think it resonates with those kinds of concerns that Dr. Dasgupta brought out in terms of how that culture of perception of students, in this case students, but nurses from different backgrounds. So we'll flip to the next slide there. A few comments that I want to address about the perspective of the nursing schools themselves. I think that there was a sort of a lack of, and perhaps this is understandable, of reflexivity, of acknowledgement of a problem of systemic discrimination. At the end of the day, as Dr. Dasgupta said, it's so hard to prove systemic discrimination. We don't have a decision, for example. I can't point you to one that says that systemic discrimination exists, for example, in the School of Nursing here at the University of Ottawa. Given the difficulties and obstacles in proving systemic discrimination, there is generally a perspective, and I think, again, I'm just following on what Dr. Dasgupta said, is saying, well, students are bringing these complaints, but maybe it's because of deficiencies. Or something that I heard from my CASN, the Association of Schools of Nursing, talk, is that not necessarily blaming the students, but blaming the environment. It's competitive, students need to preserve their marks, if they don't do well, it's going to affect their career, so that's why they do it. They actually fabricate complaints because of the competitive environment. So it's another way of victim blaming, sort of in a nice way. We'll flip to the next slide. But that being said, whereas there's not that recognition, one of the things that I saw in the last talk that I gave, as a lawyer, I was really, in a sense, persona non grata and very unwelcome, because they were like, you know, lawyers are wasting our time, they're costing money, students are appealing, and you know, we have to find a way to stave this off, because you know, it's a huge waste for staff and for contractors who don't do this all the time. So interesting from a pragmatic perspective, it's not that really the schools seem to be saying, yes, there's a systemic problem here, but you know, we can't deal with this. We can't put up with these academic appeals because students are appealing everything under the sun. So maybe we need to do something about our process. And I think that, you know, again, from a practical perspective, not necessarily for the right reason, but there seems to be a gravitation towards, and we'll flip to the next slide, something that I have emphasized, and I think the Association of Schools of Nurses have embraced this, at least from what I could tell from many comments, and I don't know if any University of Ottawa representatives were there at the conference in last fall. They may have been, but they didn't speak that I heard to my panel. That a lot of the schools are embracing kind of procedural fairness. And Dr. Dasgupta spoke a lot about subjectivity. When you talk about expression, communication, things that aren't really broken down into set objective criteria, you know, it's easy to kind of fudge it and raise concerns or complaints that are not documented, but really from the subjective perspective of the preceptor. So I think a move that I certainly would emphasize to administrations, and I did in the previous talk that I gave, is make your evaluations more transparent, make them timely, and do it in a fashion that allows for responsive participation of the students. And one of the things that this avoids, which is really quite important, is that a huge complaint is that out of the blue, at the end of a practicum, the complaint will be raised that you didn't do this, you know, you were late on these days, you know, there was these problems in communication, etc. Where that method of evaluation is responsive and interactive over time, I think it sort of changes the game. Not necessarily, again, because the university is, or the school is recognizing the existence of systemic discrimination, but one way or another, pragmatically speaking, they need to do this. They need to do this because they need to respond to a changing environment. So I think I'll leave you with this last comment on this slide. This is the last slide. That I think it was McMaster University, if I'm not mistaken, had a procedure whereby the students could actually comment on the preceptor's comments through the course of the practicum itself. So you were actually looking at not necessarily real time, but periodic and up-to-date responses on an ongoing basis from students. So is it more time-consuming? Probably. But one, does it serve the pedagogical needs of the school? I would say yes. And from a human rights perspective, and that's the perspective that I'm knowledgeable on, it certainly avoids, which is the main criticism that I come at with any academic appeal, was the process fair? So maximizing transparency and timely feedback, I think there really can be no substitute for that. So again, thank you very much.